I'm going to show you some tips on how to set up the Wahuda 8-inch joiner, but this also applies to the 6-inch and the 10-inch. I'm assuming it may also apply to some other joiners that are benchtop joiners that have the 4 screws on the infeed and outfeed table, like the Craftsman, the Cutechs, Porter cables, Rikons, Winds, etc., etc. There's a lot of them. I've gone through the process several times with my Wahuda 8-inch, and it is a little involved, but I am going to walk you through that process and give you some tips on how to manage the whole thing. Now, this is a lot of talking head to start with, but trust me, all of this is important, and it's going to go a long way into your success of tuning up your joiner. I'm also going to show you a misaligned cut with the joiner and how to identify those and how to fix those. Before we get started, you are going to need a few things, and we have a few things to discuss. You're going to need a level. Minimum 2 foot, 4 foot is probably the best. It needs to be really true and level though. We're talking thousands here. You got to really trust this thing. Next, it does help to also have a set of feeler gauges, but you could get by with a slip of paper, and I tried it for a little while and I was thankful I went out and got a set of feeler gauges. When you're done adjusting the joiner, you're going to need some test wood, not just a scrap. We need wood to practice on. I hope you're not mid-project like I was and need this for a tabletop. Don't do that. Do you have access to a pallet? It's cheap wood and you can rip pieces off of it and then try to square those up to test with. It's the cheapest wood you can get right now, I'm afraid. You need 2 pieces so we can see exactly how the joiner is cutting. It helps to have varying lengths. Start with the minimum, which is 2 inches longer than your cutter head. Then reach out to about 24 inches for your second set of test pieces. Also, if you have some just scrap 2x4s, maybe 2 of them the same length, grab those. Also, if you can, I recommend a nice big chunk of some project wood, like a 2-inch thick piece of poplar. I'll show you what I mean later. I guess a 2x4 would work here too. Try to put the joiner where you're going to use it. I know it's a benchtop tool, but I recommend a permanent spot for it. If you want to see where I put mine, check out my other videos for the planer joiner cart I built. Don't lift it by its tables. I don't think it states this anywhere in the manual, but it's just something I'm trying not to do. After you spend time aligning everything, you don't want to be lifting all that heavy weight by the very tables you just aligned. And lastly, grab all the tools that came with the joiner. Get comfortable, don't work tired, let's go. Oh yeah, unplug it, maybe even pull the safety key out. We're going to do 2 things. Level the outfeed table to the knives and level the infeed table to the outfeed table, otherwise known as coplaner. Now, before you get started, moving and turning everything, read the manual. I can't stress this enough. Read it front to back, especially while you're right in the middle of the joiner setup. It sounds so elementary, but you really have to read this thing and absorb all the details. Let's skip the fence for now, loosen it, and push it back out of the way. Take off the guard with the 2 nuts on the front. Now, like the manual states, start with the outfeed table. Let's get it level. You can lower the infeed table out of the way. Check the level of your bench that you have your joiner on. That is pretty much your reference. If it's not completely level, that's okay. If it bothers you, then you should work on this first. The joiner doesn't care if it's sitting on a completely level surface or not. It only cares if the tables are level. Now, my garage floor is definitely not level, but the joiner and the cart it is on are the same level. It's good to see this position and remember it. Okay, so now we're going to level the outfeed table with the cutter knives, and we're going to use the level, these tools provided by Wahuda, and feeler gauges if you have them. So once we've seen that movement, we want to look at the movement on the rest of the table. It's important to go from back to front all the way across and see, because this part of the table could be higher or lower. So we want not just to fix by the fence, but we want to fix it right here as well. So let's see what we have here. Just moves it ever so slightly. Do 3 or 4 points on the cutter head to the level and make sure everybody is the same. Now look at that. On mine, this part is lower. So let's check it again. Make sure we have everything, right? No, it moved it. I just wasn't lined up correctly. Now let's go to the edge, find that last knife, make sure this side of the table is good. More than likely yours is out of adjustment from the factory, and that is okay. We are going to fix it with these 4 holes right here. Now, if you were to unscrew all 4 of these large Allens, the entire table would come off, and that's okay too. I got to a point where I was so frustrated that I ended up taking the table off and resetting everything nice and level, all of the screws. So in each one of these holes there are 2 smaller Allen screws, and these are the ones that you turn one way or the other to push down on a reference post, a reference bed that is underneath here, and that's what raises and lowers the table. Now, the most difficult part is there's 4 screws. So if you lower these two generally come up a few thousandths. So you have to be cognizant of that at all times. If you need to lower, or if you need to raise these, watch out for these lowering as well. And I have even been to the point where I got everything good on knives all the way to here, and I needed to raise. You may have to do this several times in order to dial it in, and I'll give you a few tips on how to make that happen. Make sure you read the manual, of course. Always read the manual. Do 2 at a time. Try not to do 4 at a time. Do these 2, these 2, these 2, and these 2. In between, each time you make an adjustment and check that adjustment, make sure you are torquing this back down tight every single time. Don't just get it a little tight, but get it tight, because when you do that, it does move the bed up and down, and you will see that. When you are done tightening, let's say you make an adjustment over here, when you are done tightening those, you need to put the little one back in and make sure those are snug against that reference table underneath. If there's any play, it could move around. See how those, I know it's hard to tell, but you're just doing it by feel. Those are snug. Make your adjustments and then come back and check how you did. Just barely moves the level, and that's what we're looking for. Now that's the visual way to do it. If you want to get even more precise, use your feeler gauges. Bring the cutter head to the apex, the top. Put this back in there. And then try to see if you can get, a 3/1000 or a 2/1000 in there and see how it measures up all the way across each cutting head. So right now, I would consider us level on the outfeed table to the cutter knives all the way across. Now we need to move to the infeed table. Now to start the infeed process, we want to keep the level across the outfeed, but not on a blade. Keep it right there. Unlock it, and then slowly raise your infeed until it is right level with the level. And this is where the feeler gauges really come into hand. Let's call that right there. Once you feel you've got that raised up and level, it is time to work on the infeed table. Now, we're going for a term that is called coplaner, and that is to have the outfeed and the infeed completely level with each other, also in relation to the cutting head. So all 3 of these should be at the same level. So it's good, you can start with the infeed table. If it is completely out of whack, you can start working on the process just like I showed you over here, and follow the manual as well. Get this nice and level, and then you can work on coplaner to make sure that this table, and the apex of the cutting head are all in the same alignment. Once you do that, you're technically done, but there are further adjustments that we can do. Again, there's one screw that unlocks the adjustment screws, and then you go counterclockwise or clockwise a short turn with both of these screws in order to raise and lower it. See the manual for that, and have that manual beside you at all times so you don't get confused. And then, of course, lock it down with some pretty good torque and make sure that those are nice and tight before you check. And then take this and make sure those are clockwise all the way down against that reference. I should have locked that, huh? Against that reference table. We're definitely not done with our tables, but it's probably a good time to get our fence into 90 so we can make some test cuts and further refine this. Now, there are a lot of ways to do this, but I have been using 2 speed squares. Now, I like the speed square because I can get it to just sit right here. If I had an engineer square, I would probably use that, and I would probably use 2 of them if possible. So what I did is I got the 2 speed squares, unlock the fence, and get it right up to the table and lock it down right off of the table, like so. There are adjustment screws here for getting 90 and 135 degrees, and I am of the crowd that once I get it into 90, I'm probably never going to move it. So run your speed squares up and give them a little tilt and see if they are off. Now, I have found that my Lowe's speed square is more square than my Harbor Freight speed square. So it is just to get me rolling. And that one has a little bit of a wobble, and this one does not. So what I do is you just move this back lever and get it nice and square, and then relock it down. Then use the adjustment screw if needed to tilt that fence back and forth. Read the manual on this one. It's not as bad as adjusting the tables. All right, we've done the tables, we've done the fence, and what we didn't do is the infeed and outfeed extension arms. And the only thing that I would tell you is to make sure they are lower than the tables. If they are not lower, then adjust them. If not, let's keep working on the tables. Get your guard back on and make sure it is freely going back and forth without dragging on your table, or you will paint your table red like I have done. Now it's time to joint some lumber. Let's get out those pallet boards that we got in the beginning and try our hand at some edge joining and face joining. Now, you can dial this thing in perfectly and still have less than desirable results. It's very common, and it's not just these benchtop planers, or benchtop joiners rather. Most of the time it has to do with the height of the outfeed table to the height of the cutter head. And let's check that real quick. Now here's the pallet wood that came off of my Wahuda 8-inch. And if you look at these seams right here, this might not be flat, or my bench is not flat. But if you look at these glue joints right here, they are lining up really nicely. You would be able to make a glue up with these boards really nicely. Then you can move up to longer stock, and I've got these pallet boards again, and look at them. They're lining up really nicely. But you may not have that good of a result. Now let's take these scrap 2x4s and look at when there's an error in your joiner. So on the front edge, these are lining up really nicely. But on the back, if you were to use like a clamp motion, on the back you can see a nice gap. One of these boards has a bow in it. Snipe at the end or a bow in the board usually indicate the outfeed table and knives are not set up correctly. Now, I know that we went through that whole process and it looks correct, but it may be off a thousandth or so, and that is causing that. So you remember when I asked you to grab that piece of 2-inch stock in the beginning of the video? This is where it's going to come in handy. You can use thinner stock, but I like a nice big thick board because it will sit flush on your planer bed and you don't have to adjust it. And even these 2x4s would be good for this process. Run the stock about 4 inches into the joiner knives and then pull it back. Now turn off the joiner and make it safe. Glide the piece over the knives and watch as it goes over the outfeed table. This will tell you a ton about your setup. The outfeed table needs to match this cut. Does the stock hit the outfeed table, or is the outfeed table too low? Usually the outfeed table is too low. Use feeler gauges if you have them. Now, do the outfeed table again, but square it to the cut you just made. Be sure to check the whole table back and forth.
Another condition that is common is when your outfeed table, or maybe that extension wing on the outfeed table, is higher than the blade itself. And that could be a gradual rise. But if you think about that board exiting the knives, hitting the outfeed table and giving you a gradual rise, it's going to cause you to bow that board. In some conditions, with the outfeed table being too high, it will cause a snipe at the end, and sometimes you can even hear that very distinctly when the end of that board goes over the cutter head and it'll snipe off. You hear it just go snip, and that is my sound effects notwithstanding, but that is indicative of that outfeed table being a little too high, and you might want to re-level that. If you feel like that both of your outfeed and infeed table is coplanar and everything is looking good, and you're still having issues with snipe at the end of your boards or a bow in your boards, stop jointing and then go through these two things one more time. You may have a raised outfeed table, or you may have a difference of just a few thousandths between that outfeed table and your blades, and that may be causing your issue. Go over that again, use these steps, and I'm quite positive you'll find one of those two fixes will get you back into joining some straight lumber.
I know that's a lot of info, but if you follow that and read the manual page by page, word by word, you should be able to set up a nice square jointer and get some good cuts made. Let me know if you have any questions. Leave those in the comments below. I'll try to help you through the process in case I wasn't clear about something. Sometimes it's clear in my head and I just don't get it out on the camera. Also, if there's anything that I can improve on, or you have some better methods, please let me know. I'm all about improving the cuts on this joiner for sure. Now, I also have a video about this cart. Please check in the description below. I'll leave a link to that as well. And of course, thank you for watching. Give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.